Hey everybody, and welcome back. And for this lecture, we're going to conclude our examination of the 1920s, our analysis of the 1920s. And now to begin with, let me just state that that in their effort to foster, and I'm picking up right where I left off, speaking on the Republican Party in the 1920s. In their effort, in their simple mission to foster greater growth, efficiency, and international peace on the basis of a prosperous world, will be a peaceful world. The Republicans in the United States, particularly the three Republican presidents, Hoover at the end of the decade, Harding at the beginning of the decade, who died tragically in office, and Coolidge, who was president for most of the decade. They set out to accomplish this by lowering taxes, passing a federal highway act, and a new tariff was passed, the Fort Meade-Macomber tariff. Now this tariff also created the Federal Bureau of Public Roads. They also, I should say, created the Federal Bureau of Public Roads, not the tariff, to subsidize state roads and to plan a federal highway system. Now, the government itself became more efficient had the Budget and Accounting Act created the position of Director of the Budget. This had the effect of allowing the executive branch to plan out and produce a unified and coherent national budget for the first time. Progressive ideas lived on during the 1920s, as well as 34 out of the then 48 states passed workmen compensation laws. In the 1924 election, the Reformed Progressive Party nominated Robert La Follette of Minnesota. La Follette was Wisconsin, I think. Kind of embarrassing moment right there, but Robert La Follette, Senator Robert La Follette, he was nominated by the Reformed Progressive Party, and he garnered 16% of the popular vote. Not to mention, not to overlook the fact that women obtained the right to vote in the 1920s with the passage of the 20th Amendment. Now, immigration restrictions succeeded, and again, looking back to our lectures on the progressive movement, immigration restriction had been one of the progressives' aims. They sought to limit the exposure that immigrants received in the Republic. The National Origins Act restricted immigration. It excluded all immigrants from Asia from immigrating to the United States and established quotas for Southern and Eastern Europeans. The law stayed in effect until the 1960s, as scientific racism expanded in the 1920s. Now, the spread of religious and ethnic intolerance in this era and we really have to include the anti-Semitic tracts of Henry Ford. The International Jew is one of them, really just sort of damning and really hurtful to Henry Ford's legacy, but also something that sort of like tarnished the 1920s itself and sort of present a more unified look, a more complete look at what was really in effect socially in the Republic during the 1920s. The International Jew, written by Henry Ford, one of those aforementioned anti-Semitic tracts. The new Ku Klux Klan that rose in the 1920s. And this new Klan had a membership that ranged as high as 3 to 5 million people nationally. And this new Klan, as noted previously, expanded their focus to include Jewish Americans, Roman Catholic Americans, and of course immigrants. In the 1940s, 40,000 Klansmen marched on Washington, D.C. And that in and of itself was just a powerful moment for that organization, and a very, a very powerful social glimpse into what was happening domestically within the Republic. The government continued its attacks on leftist immigrants in a continuation of the first Red Scare, which included the Palmer raids, and which saw thousands of immigrant radicals be illegally arrested and detained. And that continued into the 1920s as well, and was really capped by the 1927 arrest, conviction, and execution of Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Both of these men were Italian immigrants living in Massachusetts. They were also anarchists, and they were charged with armed robbery and murder. Now, their supporters argued that the two were innocent of the armed robbery and murder charges, and that they were arrested, convicted, and executed because of what they were: immigrants and radicals. It's still a very touchy, testy subject. You have proponents who profess the innocence of Sacco and Vanzetti, and then you have those who continue to condemn them as radical anarchists who committed that murder and that robbery. Now, as noted in our previous lecture on the 1920s, the 1920s was the decade of Prohibition. Prohibition had been a progressive reform and was accomplished and was in effect. The 18th Amendment passed in 1919, and the Volstead Act, which defined alcoholic beverages as any beverage that contained 0.5% of alcohol, went into effect in 1920. It had the effect of spurring the rise of bootleg whiskey and organized crime gangs. Prohibition also led to a significant decrease in alcohol consumption in the Republic. That's something that's often not mentioned when we speak of Prohibition. It did severely curb the drinking of most Americans. Alcohol went down by 1/3 to the pre-war levels and remains the lowest alcohol consumption point in U.S. history. Prohibition also led to the demise of the saloon, which had been a key fixture in American society. Now, interestingly, and this is something that I alluded to earlier, interestingly, Prohibition enabled many Southern and Eastern European families, immigrant families, to rise out of poverty and enter the middle class, gaining both acceptance and respectability in the process. It is really funny to note that bootlegging was the only laissez-faire business in the history of the United States. Well, at least for that time, there are other laissez-faire businesses, and all illegal businesses are really laissez-faire businesses, because the government doesn't do anything to really suppress them, but the government also didn't do anything to restrict it. Roman Catholicism, as I stated earlier, grew as well during the 1920s, with many people converting to Roman Catholicism simply to gain access to communion wine. The Catholic Church lobbied hard and fought for the right to continue communion wine, and they actually they would inspect it. They would get a list of the rolls of the adult members who were taking communion wine, and they would deliver only the amount of wine needed for communion. So that was something. So that was something. I tried to find to see if I could locate any newspaper articles in which somebody was reported for or barred from a church because they took too much. They drank too much communion wine, or whether there were instances of somebody going to mass at different churches just so that they can get some wine. But yeah, the Catholic Church, the number of Catholics grew exponentially during the 1920s, which also fueled the anti-Catholicism of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, Herbert Hoover, before becoming president, had organized the famine relief at the end of World War I, and he has served as the Secretary of Commerce under both Harding and Coolidge. Hoover was an efficiency expert, and in many ways, he was influenced by the progressive movement. During his tenure as Secretary of Commerce, he actively aided domestic businesses and expanding globally, as well as directing overseas investment One of these was the Dawes Plan. Now the Dawes Plan with the loaning of private money to Germany and negotiating linked reparation payments for Germany for their World War I debt, negating a outlook, and it really this was done to negate what many had seen, and that was a looming crisis over repayment. If Germany didn't have the money to make those repayments, then the United States couldn't look forward to repayments for all those wartime loans made to France and Great Britain. So this was done had a sort of preemptive measure. Now, the State Department under Charles Evans Hughes and Frank B. Kellogg actively promoted the signing of international treaties to help preserve the new peace. These new treaties, like the 1922 Treaty of Washington, included naval arms limitations and an open door policy in China. In 1930, the 1930 London Naval Arms Treaty also included restrictions on naval arming, and the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, outlawing the use of war as an instrument of national policy. These were all very progressive moves, and really not designed to look back toward the 1890s or 1880s at all. Domestically, the culture wars between the newly ascendant urban culture squared off with that fading rural culture that we spoke about last time, one that really reared its head with the Scopes trial. In 1924, the Democratic Party was badly conflicted between the urban representatives from the eastern urban centers and the rural representatives from the southeast over the party's official nominee. They were also split on the party's stance on Prohibition and the resurgent Ku Klux Klan. In a particularly telling moment, the vote to condemn the Ku Klux Klan failed by a single vote. The conflict over the party's presidential nominee saw New York sitting governor Al Smith, a Roman Catholic and a wet, was someone who opposed Prohibition, contest William McAdoo, a Protestant and a Dry, someone who supported Prohibition. And also, you remember, McAdoo was a member of Wilson's cabinet. But this is where it all boiled down to. It took 103 ballots for the convention to find a compromise candidate, John W. Davis. And again, even if they had been willing to overlook the whole wet stigma of Al Smith was still a Roman Catholic, and being a Roman Catholic meant that he could not count on any of those Dixiecrat votes, because many of the Dixiecrat votes were Klan members. They had their backing. They were supported by Klan members back home. Many of them had Klan sympathies themselves. So Smith, just by being a Catholic, was undesirable to them. Now the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial also widened the gap between the urban and rural dwellers that we noted. In Tennessee, John Scopes challenged the law that banned the teaching of evolution in schools. He was convicted in the first trial ever broadcast over radio. His conviction was not the main attraction. As I keep alluding to, the main attraction was the sparring, the verbal duel between the aging William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. And it's really interesting because Jennings came in, and Jennings, who defended the state of Tennessee, he came in as an expert Bible witness for the prosecution. And that right there really says a lot. The expert Bible witness for the prosecution. It was really sort of like the centerpiece of these cases. The righteousness of teaching evolution was was not even close to being the centerpiece. In the verbal duel, as I stated in our previous discussion on this, Darrow humiliated Brian, and it caught by mocking Brian's literal interpretation of creation and biblical stories. Most notably, that if Joshua had indeed made the sun stand still, the earth would have turned into a molten mess. Darrow also forced Brian to modify his literal interpretation by admitting that creation may have lasted millions of years instead of just 6 days. During the interchange, during the exchange, there was another sort of awareness being fostered, being expanded upon, and that was one regarding rural and urban communities. Urban communities were regarded as sophistication and appropriateness of learning, and rural communities were increasingly becoming viewed as these sort of backward hicks, if you want to use the term yokel, centered for like yokels and rubes. The jury took less than 10 minutes to convict, and Brian was humiliated, and he died shortly after the trial. It was a terrible way to conclude his public legacy, but William Jennings Bryan certainly left the trial much tarnished, with his reputation much tarnished. Have we seen, the 1920s was much more complex than first understood or even first thought, and was very conservative in many ways. The elimination of so many taxes on the wealthy, the slashing of the federal budget, it was also a very progressive and a very reactionary age, as the modern American economy and urban culture were developed. There was also a very active foreign policy that benefited from cooperation between government and big business, that sought to achieve the goals of peace and prosperity in most areas. As the result of a creation of a peaceful and prosperous global society. The United States really was the most peaceful. The 1920s really saw the most peaceful and prosperous years of the 20th century for the United States. All of these outcomes, however, hinged on one factor, and that factor was the continued health and growth of the United States economy. And when that collapsed in 1929, the entire structure that had been developed by the United States collapsed. And we'll end there. Thank you for watching. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about the analysis of the 1920s. The 20s still fascinate me. Has to do with a lot of people. Not really the fashion for me, but just the dynamics of the larger-than-life figures that sort of roamed and sort of dictated our future. Or at least sort of dictated their futures, their times, and impacted our futures. But that's all I have for you now, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.